Stacy Lynn Harp is coaching with heart. Thank you for listening to this audio presentation. To learn more about Stacy and her coaching services, visit stacylharp.com. That's STACYL harp.com.
Welcome everybody to this edition of Coaching with Heart. Yes, today what we're going to do is we're going to discuss codependency. Oh yeah, we are going to do that. And I don't know about you, but I have personally struggled with this issue. And I would venture to guess that probably most people have. And for a while, many years ago, this was like the hot topic. Everybody and their grandmother were talking about this topic. And I just remember that, there were books written about it and everything. It was almost like a fad to say, hey, I'm so codependent. It was like a good thing. But really, codependency is nothing to laugh about, and it's not a laughing matter. It's a very serious problem, and it can create difficulties in relationships. And I know right now, I know one person in particular I'm thinking of who is in an extremely codependent relationship, and trying to get her to understand how unhealthy it is annoying, because they realize it's an unhealthy relationship, but they really don't want to change. And that's sad, and that actually says a lot about the person. So what we're going to do today is I'm going to define for you what codependent is, and then we're going to look at, for this first show, we're going to look at the first four characteristics of codependency. And this is going to be a little bit different because I'm not going to give you a lot of examples from Scripture. This is really more just kind of for you to get an idea if in your relationships you're in this, okay? And then the other thing is, though, what I want to say is that what I'm trying to help you here with is to shift your focus from that other person, or persons, if you happen to have more than one in your life, back on to Christ. So let me reveal, I'm going to reveal this to you now. Ready? Here it is. Okay. By the way, I have to say, I really love doing this show. It's just really fun. I love it. It's one of my favorite parts of my day. But anyway, let me remind you of the scripture that we shared with you a couple of weeks ago. And this is Galatians chapter 1, verse 10. And listen to this. It says, "For am I now seeking the favor of men or of God? Or am I striving to please men? If I were still trying to please men, I would not be a bondservant of Christ." And then Matthew chapter 6, verse 24 says, "No one can serve two masters. Either you will hate the one and love the other, or you will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money." And I would add also that you cannot serve both God and that other person that you've put in the place of God. So I would encourage you to memorize Galatians chapter 1, verse 10. Again, I'm reading this in the New American Standard. "For am I now seeking the favor of men or of God, or am I striving to please men? If I were still trying to please men, I would not be a bondservant of Christ." So you can't serve that person and Christ equally. You just can't. Okay? So, and that's very convicting, isn't it? So it is to me. Now, here is the definition, the dictionary definition of the word codependent. This is what it means. It means of or pertaining to a relationship in which one person is physically or psychologically addicted as to alcohol or gambling, and the other person is psychologically dependent on the first in an unhealthy way. Okay? Again, let me read that again. This is of or pertaining to a relationship in which one person is physically or psychologically addicted, so here we go, physically and psychologically, as to alcohol or gambling, just as an example, and the other person is psychologically dependent on the first in an unhealthy way. I can tell you that one of the interesting dynamics of a therapeutic relationship is that it is really easy for the client to become codependent on the therapist. The therapist generally is disconnected from the client because they're not sharing all of their stuff. So they don't have that type of unhealthiness. And that's one of the benefits, actually, to going to therapy and dealing with this particular issue, is because that therapist can help the codependent see things that they are not dealing with personally, the therapist. Although I would have to say that a lot of therapists are very unhealthy people in the first place, and they end up going and becoming therapists because they have their own needs that they want to get met, and then that doesn't really do anybody any good. So you got to be very careful with whoever it is you get as a therapist. So basically, we're looking at somebody who's codependent, who is psychologically addicted or physically addicted to being with somebody else. Okay, I want to read you a couple quotes. Found these over at Goodreads. So if you want to go to goodreads.com, you can look up this word and this is what it says. So Melody Beattie, who is very famous for writing her book Codependent No More, How to Stop Controlling Others and Start Caring for Yourself, said this. She said, codependents are reactionaries. They overreact, they underreact, but rarely do they act. They react to the problems, pains, lives, and behaviors of others. They react to their own problems, pains, and behaviors. That's pretty profound if you think about it. So let me say this again. Codependents are reactionaries. Do you know anybody that way? Oh my gosh, I sure do. They overreact or they underreact, but rarely do they act. See, there's a difference between acting and reacting. When you're reacting, you're in a state of crisis most of the time. When you act, you have to be a big girl or a big boy, and you have to decide what you're going to do. And I would say, if I really wanted to get psycho-Babylonia, what I would say is codependents are generally, if I wanted to throw Freudian language at you, I would say they are controlled by their id, which is the child part of them. So you got the id, ego, and superego that Freud talks about, and the id, it really is the immature, childlike part of you that has never been fully developed. There was some type of attachment disruption or interruption, and so that person is emotionally still a child. Whereas the superego and codependents can be controlled by their superego too, which is more like the parental voice. And then the ego, that's your adult, which hopefully, if you have a healthy ego, then it means you're balanced. So, there's a balance there in your head. So what Melody Beattie here is saying is that codependents are reactionaries. They overreact, they underreact. In other words, they can't regulate their emotions very well, but rarely do they act. They react to the problems, pains, lives, and behaviors of others. And this is interesting because I know people that will say to me, I'll say, how are you doing? And they'll say, oh, I'm I'm not that great, or horrible things are going on with friends in my world or at my church and all this other stuff. And I'll go, well, what's the issue? Well, everybody's going through such horrible things. It's hard for me to deal with it and blah, blah, blah. And the reason why is because that person, whether they realize it or not, is codependent, and they're a control freak, actually, too. They're trying to control everybody, and they're trying to be the god to whatever that situation is or the person that they're going in, because they think, for some reason, that's how they are going to be accepted. And they react to their own problems, pains, and behaviors. It's the same thing, but they don't deal with it. See, you can react, but not deal with something, right? Okay. So here's another quote. This is by A.J. Kitt, and they say, you have no control over what the other guy does. You only have control over what you do. Okay, so, and that is very true, and that's one of the keys to getting over codependency. So now what we're going to do is I'm going to begin to share with you here 4 characteristics of codependence. Here's the first one. Do you struggle with feeling loved And therefore, as a result of that, look for ways to be needed. All right, so do you struggle with feeling loved? And as a result, look for ways to be needed. Okay? If you're somebody who struggles with feeling loved, or you wonder if people love you, sometimes this is what people do who struggle with codependency. They're looking for ways to be needed. And like I said, one way a lot of people do that is to become a therapist. I think also pastors do this. I remember many years ago I was working with a ministry, and part of my job was to call pastors, and that's what I did. And I would ask them, hey, why'd you become a pastor? And they said, because I wanted to be needed. And so if you have a pastor, it'd be interesting to ask him that question. Why'd you become a pastor? I think more often than not, you'll find people who are honest. They'll say, well, I wanted to be needed. I wanted people to like me. So if you're struggling with feeling loved, you always look for ways to be needed. And this is excess, by the way. This isn't, it's good to be needed and to help out. But there's one thing to be needed versus, just helping out too. Number 2, second way codependency reveals itself is, if you answer this question, do you throw all of your energy into helping another person? If the answer to that question is yes, then you're probably codependent in that relationship. Because no one person needs to be spending and throwing all of their energy into helping one person. And here's the thing, that person that you're helping will never have the time or the desire to help themselves if you're the one constantly trying to help them out. And you know what? It's so funny because at practically every single church I've ever gone to, there was always somebody in that church who was constantly in crisis. I'm thinking of one woman in particular at my last church. Older, sweet, dear lady, but every time you ask her something, how you doing, it was always a major crisis, and there was always somebody in that church who was always trying to help her. They never gave her the opportunity to grow and help herself. And so I would examine that. If you throw all your energy into helping another person, then you could be codependent. This next one is a big one. You say no when you should say yes, and yes when you should say no. And I know I've discussed this before in previous shows, but if a person without boundaries is a big mess, right? I'm just going to say it. If you can't say no to somebody, then you have zero boundaries. Zero. Bzz, zip, nada. You are boundaryless. There is room for enmeshment and just disaster happening there. And so if you're somebody who says no to somebody when you should be saying yes, and you say yes when you should be saying no, then you are probably in a situation where you're codependent. And you know what? Some parents, unfortunately, fall into this characteristic. They have children that they can't say no to, or they'll cave and they'll say yes to them because they're being manipulated and controlled by their child. Husbands and wives deal with this issue. Sometimes you might be in a marital relationship where that situation, let's say, only one part of that couple gets their way. It's like, oh my gosh. So, and I know somebody like this actually in a marriage. Doesn't matter what she does, the husband always gets his way because she doesn't have enough of herself. She doesn't want to do all the things that he says, but she'll go ahead and bow to him, and it's because she's codependent. She doesn't know how to have a mind of her own or think for herself. And it's really a sad situation, actually. All right, today we're going to look at one more, because I'm really trying to limit the time of these shows. And the fourth one is, you feel compelled to take charge of another person's crisis. Okay? Oh my gosh, have you ever been in a situation where you see somebody and they're a big mess? And all of these are really kind of related, but it's like, oh my gosh, you have to take charge. That's who you are. You are gonna make sure that everybody in their grandmother knows about the situation, and you're gonna take charge of the situation. Case in point, an example of that could be something as simple as, let's say somebody died, and you don't know what to do, and that other person really doesn't want your help, but you decide you're going to go ahead and form a food drive so that everybody in the church or everybody in the neighborhood or everybody, that you know personally will bring food to that family, even though that family didn't really care or want it. Now, granted, this is something that's common, and in some cases it's not a codependent problem, but it could be anything. It could be, so-and-so lost their job, so okay, now I'm going to take it upon myself to go and look through all the ads. I'm going to search the internet for jobs for this person, and I'm going to go down to the employment agency and fill out an application for them, and I'm going to apply for, medical benefits, and I'm going to do all this stuff, and I'm going to take charge, of this crisis, because you just need to be needed, and that falls back into that category that you need to be needed. You're throwing all your energy into that person, and you can't say no. And you're just like, oh my gosh, here I am. I'm super person. I'm here to save that person's life. And the funny thing is codependents. You could kind of see, they wear capes with a big C on their chest. Look at me, because they are trying literally to take the place of God in that person's life, whether they know it or not. And this is where, for Christians, it's really good to step back and remember that God does things in other people's lives that we don't understand, and that we have to step back and trust God. And I'll give you a perfect example. When my mom was diagnosed with cancer a number of years ago, there's not a situation any of us have gone through. If you've ever had somebody with cancer in your family, you know that is the most out of control feeling you're ever going to feel in your life, because there's nothing you can do, right? Absolutely nothing you can do. And because there is nothing you can do. The only thing you can do is be there for your loved one when they have cancer. And I remember my teacher telling me this sound advice, and it was the best advice I ever got. I was in grad school at the time, so it kind of helped that I was surrounded by therapists during that time. This is what he said to me, though. He said, don't do anything. He said, just stay there and watch and observe what happens. He said, you don't have to do anything except be there for your mom. Just have your presence be there, but you don't have to fix the situation. You don't have to go in, and you don't have to take over her doctor's appointments or all her medications or driving her everywhere. You don't have to become enmeshed in that situation. Just step back and watch. Because there was plenty of help my mom had, and as it turned out, I ended up doing a lot of that stuff anyway, but not because it was me trying to be unhealthy. It was truly because I really wanted to serve my mom and during that time, and that's actually how she came to Christ, was through that time. But the counsel I got was just be there and watch. And codependents can't do that. They have to do something. They can't just stay there and just observe and just have that be a ministry of presence, because God is at work doing something and you can't see it. And when you're in there, it's kind of like the Mary Martha syndrome, you gotta sit and just watch. But the codependent can't do that. The codependent's constantly moving around and doing things, trying to control the whole situation. And that's really what's underneath codependency, is control. That person generally feels totally out of control. So if that's you today, let me just encourage you to, pray and go to the Lord and say, hey, help me out here. I totally need it. And remember Galatians 1:10. And really meditate on that. Am I now seeking the favor of men or of God? Am I striving to please men? And if I were still trying to please men, I would not be a bondservant of Christ. Tomorrow we'll continue this. And if you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments. And I look forward to continuing our discussion tomorrow. Thank you for listening.
Thank you for listening to this audio presentation. To discover more resources from Stacy Lynn Harp, clinically trained marriage and family therapist and biblical coach. Visit StacyLHarp.com. That's STACYL Harp.com. Coaching with Heart.